Hello friends, good morning and welcome to the EduSat Network. Our topic of discussion for today is Premchand's Afterlife and Growing Relevance. So friends, for this very lecture we have with us in our studio our subject expert Dr. Anand Prakash, retired professor of English, University of Delhi. Dr. Anand Prakash has taught English for more than 4 decades. And friends, with this very brief introduction, I would like to welcome sir to our studio and also request him to begin our today's lecture. Thank you for coming, sir.
Thanks, Urvashi. And this lecture on Premchand is one, that connects him with us in a specific way. Premchand died as all of us know, he died in 1936, 11 years before the country became free. And since he was a very significant part, not merely at the level of culture, but also at the level of society and ideology, of the significant part of the national movement. Therefore, he should have lived longer, we wish, so that he could see as to how the nation finally emerged in its success against British imperialism. That didn't happen, but Premchand, is still relevant. That is the assumption of the present lecture. And in this connection, that Premchand's relevance grows with time is something that has dawned on us. Around the time when Premchand's first centenary was being celebrated in 1980. Now, there is a background to the celebration and the background to the reading of Premchand in a different manner than when he was alive. For instance, I tell you, and this has been shared earlier also.
Sir, if I can just briefly interrupt you, sorry to break the chain of thoughts, but my query or a certain thought that comes to me is that when we are talking about Premchand's afterlife and his growing relevance. So, can we sort of certify the statement that he became more popular after he died and his works began to be read even more after that? Or can we say that the popularity sort of remained the same as popular he was during his life as after his death?
That's very good to ask this question right in the beginning, because this will straight away relate me, viewers, to the topic. Premchand was, as has been said in earlier discussions, was a household name till his death in 1936. The whole of North India, up to the villages, not merely towns and cities, read him. And if there was just one person, or there were a few people in the village who could read Hindi, then the book would be made available, or this person would get the book from somewhere and read it, and then would talk about the book that he read by Premchand with his fellow beings in the village. And sometimes the stories, not the novels, but the stories would be read out to an audience which was illiterate. So it was that kind of popularity that Premchand enjoyed in his lifetime. But Urvashi, you are right in asking this question, because there was a period from 1940 onwards up to 1975, 1970 let's call it, when Premchand was persistently criticized for being a mere kissa-go, not a literary writer in the sense in which we understood the term then, because something had happened to the cultural scene, to the educational scene. Authors were not being read directly by the readers in the villages and the cities, but were read as a kind of a subject in the college and university departments. Premchand had become a writer who would be included in the textbooks, and therefore people would study whatever he wrote. So the emphasis of literature, so far as Premchand is concerned, had been shifted from reading of literature for pleasure and for some kind of education to something that is an item of discussion, item of analysis, and that's what had happened between 1940 and 1970. So it is necessary to find out what made Premchand come back to the cultural scene around 1980, when the first centenary was celebrated. And to talk directly about the question, I would say that Premchand has grown in popularity from 1980 onwards. Of course, he can't be as popular as he was in his time, but who knows, maybe another 10, 15 years and Premchand would be still more popular than he was in his lifetime. So this popularity is growing. That's why the title of the discussion today is Growing Relevance. And popularity and relevance, in my opinion, go together. If you are relevant, if you are addressing, if the writer is addressing the issues that we face today, if the writer has anticipated these issues in his own lifetime. Now there are many writers who are read more today than they would be read earlier. Examples are in a large number all over the world. One doesn't know how much Kabir would be, for instance, be popular in his own lifetime, but Kabir's popularity in the 20th century is phenomenal. The same thing would be true of Tagore and in our case Premchand, that his popularity in the last 30, 40 years has really grown from year to year. So that way, this question raises certain curiosities. It makes us aware of certain issues that Premchand may have raised, and those issues still persist. And because of that, people would like to read him. So I'll go into this question in the course of the discussion, but right in the beginning, let me give this information again. A little focus this time. I mentioned it in the earlier discussions, but let me focus on this. That when the first centenary was being observed in 1980, then people started wondering as to who Premchand was and what he was doing. And there were a large number of magazines which brought out special numbers on Premchand, and Premchand's relevance was being established once again at that time. And it was against a background that was a bit stingy in its appreciation of Premchand in the previous decades. So I'll first tell you as to what had happened between 1940 and 1970 that necessitated a reinterpretation of Premchand, a reassessment and a re-evaluation of Premchand, so that when the first centenary occurred in 1980, at that point of time, people thought of him as a great subject of study, curiosity, and interest. Premchand was the maker of Hindi prose and Urdu prose, and he was also the person who established the short story and the novel form, in the way in which we see it today. Before Premchand, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, there was no Hindi novel worth the name. There might have been a few works, which could be called novel, could be put under the category of the novel, but the way Premchand took it up, this form, for expressing himself, that evolved with time in his own case. His first novel is not as evolved, it is not as rich in content, is not as strong in its appeal as his next novel would be. And this process goes on and on. And in fact, it has been so consistent in his case that his first novel may be his weakest novel, and his last novel is his greatest novel. And the growth that happens in the case of Premchand, that is always upwards. And when he dies in 1936, Godhan, the last novel that he wrote, completed and published, within a couple of months of the publication of this novel, Premchand dies. So just see that the greatest novel that he wrote, that is published the same year, in fact, the same quarter of the year in which Premchand breathes his last. So this kind of a thing, doesn't occur generally in people's lives. There might be just a few examples the world over where, the writer went on from strength to strength and established a form. But so far as Premchand is concerned, this form was taken up by him. I'm quoting an important, progressive writer of the 20th century, Bhairav Prasad Gupta, who said, that Premchand took this form up as something in its infancy. And when he finally wrote his strongest novel, his greatest novel, by that time the form had been established. So Premchand had that kind of contribution to make to the form, evolution of the form called the novel. And everybody was saying Premchand and naming and referring to him again and again. And as has been earlier also mentioned, Premchand was called Upanyas Samrat, the king of the novel. So that kind of a thing was there, but there was a slump. There was a slump in the 1940s, and this slump occurred because at that point of time, Hindi literature particularly, and other literatures, I believe also in the natural course, they started raising questions about art in literature, about appeal in literature, about the form in literature. And then, people had in the meantime become aware of developments in, literary trends elsewhere outside India. And then they started comparing the forms that were popular here with the forms that were popular there. And then, they started raising the question, that India was lagging behind in the evolution of these literary forms. And the reference also came back to Premchand, that the novel in English starts in the 18th century, and in the 19th century it's very rich, and it has started looking inwards, and there is so much of depth, there's so much of rich content there, and that kind of thing is not there in Premchand or in the other Indian novels. So this kind of a discussion started in 1940 onwards. The second thing that also drew notice was that Premchand was a realist, and he was continuously really referring to the reality of his time. And when that happened, then people started raising questions about realism also, and people used words like it's a realism that looks upwards towards idealism. In Hindi it was called adarshonmukh yatharthvad. It looks towards the adarsh, the ideal, and it remains rooted in reality. So that kind of a thing was coined, in the case of Premchand. But then finally people started raising questions even about realism, and they started saying that, well, realism talks only about the social reality, and it doesn't bother about the unknown, mysterious areas of the mind, and unless psychology is brought in, unless the characters are presented in their depth and evolution, and all those things. The jargon was taken from European and other references. So Premchand came under criticism, and then what happened was, immediately after 1947, when the country became free, that schools and universities were opened in a big scale. Hindi came to be read as an independent subject. In schools, initially there used to be a teacher who would teach Sanskrit and Hindi, and now there were specialists and experts in Hindi reading and writing and studies. And these departments, necessitated all these things, all these issues to be taken up in the classroom and in the written books. And these questions were raised. And finally, attack occurred also on Premchand's kind of style of writing. For instance, people said, that he was telling a story. He was not consistent with what is called the three unities: time, place, and action. And that if the story has to be artistically rich and artistically relevant, then it should be focusing more or less entirely on experience, all those things. And then Premchand would not fit in this kind of a picture, and therefore people started criticizing him. And it so happened the attack, the criticism was so persistent that in the 1950s nobody would talk about Premchand. I started myself reading, some kind of literature in the late 50s, and in the early 60s I was growing up as a reader of Hindi literature, and I realized that either there were no references to Premchand, or if there were references, they were all critical references. That we have moved away from Premchand, we have left him behind, and this person only knows how to tell a story. But the story doesn't take us into the experience of the person, and so on and so forth. So this Urvashi is the background against which Premchand finally emerged in the 1970s, when people started criticizing those trends of the 50s and 60s, when there was undue emphasis on experience, and that experience was only of the urban middle class, and literature became narrowed and confined only to the urban middle class life. And some people started asking the question, where is the village in literature? Where is the small town in literature? Where are the poor people in literature? Where are the illiterates in literature? Where are women in literature? Nobody was talking about them. There were some women, there will be middle class women, they would be found in the writing of the day, but then only their problems vis-a-vis their household, they will be discussed, and that household being common, nobody would know what is happening on the street, what is happening in the small towns, in the neighborhood, etc. And therefore, people became a sort of, one should say, fed up with the middle class existence and experience in literature all the time, and then they looked towards Premchand for help and for inspiration. So in 1970s, the question of relevance became important. What is relevant in literature? How is it relevant to us? How do we understand, the problems of life by reading literature, and whether literature can totally ignore life and its situations and can remain only an aesthetic experience. These questions were debated very intensely in the 1970s, and the result of this was that as 1980 approached, people had understood the importance of Premchand in a different manner, that that kind of writing should actually be brought in. So come 1980, and we have the celebration of Premchand, and important magazines bring out discussions on Premchand, and there are some special numbers. And then in 1980s, most of the important writers, the young writers, they look for inspiration not towards the trends existing in the 1950s and 60s, but to the trends that Premchand represented, writing in the 1920s and 30s. And this is one aspect, and maybe I'll come to it later, but maybe some certain things were happening in society and polity at that time, because of which people started expecting certain things from literature. Is literature to talk about life and society, or should it remain confined to aesthetics? This question was raised consistently outside the academe, also inside the academe, but mainly outside the academe. And in 1980s, when these questions were raised, then Premchand once again cropped up as a person who would be much more relevant than the writers of the day. So this is how Premchand emerges in his afterlife. He is once again born. He is reborn in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, and this is where he'll become a subject of discussion more and more. So anything you would like to comment here on this, and or I could go to.
Of course, very interestingly, we could see how from being read by people, say we talked about Godan in 1936, he was read at that time relatively important. Then his importance reduced and people started attacking him with a very persistent attack, and then again he emerged in the 1970s and of course celebrated in the 1980s. And what is very interesting is that he continues to be celebrated.
Yes, in fact I can mention it straight away here, that when the 125th year of Premchand was celebrated in 2005, then there were a greater number of magazines and a greater number of books containing articles on his works, and Premchand around 2000 becomes an industry in the academic world. So anybody any scholar pursuing an MPhil or a PhD would think of choosing Premchand as a topic. So it might be realism of Premchand, it might be a novel of Premchand, it might be certain stories of Premchand, it might be an issue that is reflected in Premchand and things like that. And 125 years, Premchand is a different person altogether. It sweeps, it floods the people out of existence in 2005, and the trend continues so much that when 60 years of Premchand's death, that happened in 1996, which means that his matter becomes copyright free, then almost every important publisher brings out one's own editions of Premchand's works, and now these are available in so many different formats, Premchand complete works and all, so they are available now. So that way Premchand is selling quite a lot at the present time, and I'm sure that this afterlife is going to be much more rich in the ultimate sense than the life that Premchand lived at that time. Of course, these things are not to be mentioned in the lectures, but people say that Premchand himself was a very poor person, but his family became quite rich, and that there was prestige that his sons owned, and used for bringing out and selling his novels, and they would be selling in not in thousands but lakhs of copies. So that kind of money is involved in all this, and now Premchand is a cult figure, not merely in Hindi but in Indian literature as a whole. So this is the background against which we should now try to go into the reasons as to why Premchand becomes more relevant to us today, and how he is being interpreted in a different manner than before. So I have a few points, viewers, to share with you.
Sir, if I can interrupt you before we start on a newer topic, I was just curious. We have read Premchand's translation in English, of course, in other languages, but during his life, was he translated into any languages, or it happened after his death?
I think largely it happened after his death.
Right.
Because a large number of works of literature would be translated into Indian languages.
Right.
And since Premchand was writing in Hindi, so there would be translations in Punjabi and Marathi and other languages. But so far as I know, the first or second translation of Godan occurred only in the 1970s,
right,
or maybe 60s. P. Lal, brought out a translation of Premchand. It is called The Gift of a Cow. Then Rodermal's translation came. It was a UNESCO project under which his novel was published. But these English translations and translation in other languages is a post-independence phenomenon.
Right.
But in his lifetime, his works would be available in Indian languages, but I don't think they would be available at that time in the European languages in general, or English in particular. So this is what, and why Premchand becomes relevant to us, is a matter that we have to take up now, and let's just discuss in a general sense a few points that I've jotted down, and I'd like to share them with you. The first thing that attracts us towards Premchand is his focus on the reality of life in the village. He is a writer of the village. He is a writer who brings in the village in focus, and India, as everyone knows, is a country of villages. 60%, 70%, 80% of the population lives in villages. And these villages relate to the cities and to the country in a manner in which perhaps they would not relate in other countries in the world. And since Premchand has got this grasp over the life in the village, therefore most people would like to understand the village through Premchand's writing. What kind of social relations existed in the village? What was the nature of exploitation in the villages? How people celebrated, how people enjoyed themselves, if at all, in the village. What problems they faced. All this, if one has to know, then one has to go back to Premchand, because the contemporary writing doesn't talk about the village as much or as consistently as Premchand did. So the first point that I want to emphasize in this discussion is that Premchand is talking about that village which is common to the Indian population, and which bears the brunt of what I call commercialism and capitalism. Village, is threatened all over. Village is under constant strain from problems that are posed to it by the city and the small town, and because the village suffers, because of the pressures from the city and the policies that city dwellers pursue. Therefore, this kind of pain and suffering that is seen in the village can be understood only with help from Premchand. So, and the reference that of a very intense kind of a writing, in Premchand, so far as the village is concerned, this reference is to, as already Urvashi has mentioned, Godan, or to another novel, Rang Bhumi, to which I made a reference in other discussions. These are the novels, where Premchand is centering the village and surrounding it with a kind of ethos that is commercialist in nature. Those who have read Godan would realize that it's about a village in which a peasant called Hori lives. with his family, with his wife, with his children. And this village, has been brought to life in such a manner, that when you read the novel, you realize that this village is clearly before your eyes, before our eyes, and there are relationships that are there between one person and another within the family. There is a kind of a relationship between the family and the neighborhood, and then the whole village is related in a particular manner with the person who is a landlord who lives elsewhere, but then who takes money and who takes part of the produce from the villagers and passes it on to other authorities and bigwigs in the country. So you realize that Premchand talks about a village. The village's name is Belari. It's just a name in the novel, but then this has a Rai Sahab. This also has Rai Sahab's friends, and those friends come from the towns and the city, and some of them are bankers, some others are politicians. So you realize that even though Premchand is talking in Godan about a village, he is also bringing in people from the city, and then this particular interaction that occurs between the villagers on one side and the city dwellers on the other, this interaction is of prime importance in the novel. Now, is India like that today? Today means 1980, when Premchand's first centenary is celebrated, or later? Now, this is a question that we should pose to ourselves. Our answers, is both yes and no. India is not the same. India is highly industrialized in the 1970s onwards, 1980s. It's not the same village. If you go to the village today, you will not find perhaps a person like Hori, a person who has the kind of family that Hori has. And no, because yes, because Premchand's village is quite similar to today's village, in the sense that today's peasant has all kinds of pressures coming from the fellow farmer, the fellow peasants, as well as people outside. There is increasing indebtedness. The people are more and more in debt. The bank has become much more prominent in the village today. There is no such bank so far as this village captured by Premchand is concerned. So there are many dissimilarities and many similarities. But what is common to Premchand's village and today's village in India is the suffering of the peasant. And the hot topic of discussion, even in the last few years, has been of the farmer suicides. And if these suicides are common to the whole of India, they are there in Maharashtra, they are there in UP, they are there in other parts of the country, then it is that farmer who has a very close alliance with what Hori is in this novel. So if you read Godan today, then you realize that peasants face this problem in Premchand's time and in today's period, and the topic is still a burning topic. In fact, some people might even say that the problem of the village has become much more intense with time. It wasn't perhaps as bad. There are stories in Premchand like Sawa Ser Gehu, or there are other stories which he was writing in the 1930s. So if you read those stories, you realize that there was immense poverty in the village at that time, and today the same kind of poverty exists. So that poverty is common. Was there education in Premchand's time and in the village? No, not at all. Today you have some kind of education in the village, but then schools don't function. There might be no teachers. You read other novels, about it's a stray novel. Rag Darbari is a novel written in the 1960s, and here you have all kinds of politicians operating through the village school. But then one knows that education has not really reached the large number of masses in the post-independence period. So you realize that conditions are different and yet the same. Different in the sense, that there is a change in the ethos, but then the situation, around the central issues remains more or less the same. So you have, if you read Godan and if you read Rangbhumi, then you start feeling after some time that one is talking, Premchand is talking also to us today, and the same problems exist. The second point that I make, apart from this, that there is an emphasis on village in the Premchand. The second point that I say is that in today's world, humanist culture is under attack. Nobody talks about humanism in life also. You ask a young student from a university or from a school, planning one's career, nobody will say that one should be a humanist. all children, all the young people will say, we want to make money, we want to make our career, we want to rise from progress to one kind of progress to another kind of progress. And Premchand would be critical of this. And there are many people in the country, and they don't generally express themselves. They don't have the guts to, don't have the requisite encouragement to express themselves. But people are not happy, that humanist culture is under attack, and that one should always progress even at the cost of human happiness, and one should not bother about taking social collective steps against misery and poverty. So this crass opportunism and careerism that is spreading all over the country, now this is creating an awareness that people should live at the level of collectivity, and they should fight these problems because they are collective problems. They should fight at the collective level. So this kind of emphasis is there in Premchand, and this kind of emphasis is required in today's world. Therefore, I would say that Premchand would be much more useful reading in today's context, because then we'll become aware of those solutions which we are trying hard to find and we are not getting. So, would you say something regarding this? That reading Premchand will give us the answers to the problems that we face today.
Sir, I totally agree with the idea also you pointed out, that we are so occupied with the crass opportunism and say careerism, that we are sort of forgetting the real, the idea of humanism that you talked about. Nobody wants to be a humanist as opposed to making a career or being trying to achieve more money. So definitely these values and these ideas, if are coming up in Premchand's writing, and if one reads him carefully, one would be able to understand what is the real sense of life. Of course, money has to be earned to live, but the human values, the ability to understand another person, the kind of empathy and the situation that he brings up in his novels, like we took the example of Godan and the family of Hori, one feels really sympathetic towards him at the end, and one really wants to do something for these villagers and farmers, as of course it's even very pertinent in today's concern, where so many villagers are committing suicide and we are not able to do much for them.
Very true. And also consider it in the context of a large number of women now getting education, and women are more idealistic. I find them very sensitive today. So when they would read Premchand and they would find strong women characters there, then they would derive a lot of appeal from Premchand. That is because this new population of India, a literate population called women, when they read Premchand, they'll find a great deal of appeal in Premchand. And the kind of humanism that Premchand preaches, I would say, because it is talking directly to the reader there, that will make Premchand quite relevant. In fact, I'm pleasantly surprised, that Premchand is today more powerful, more appealing, and stronger in appeal than among women than he is among men. I don't think boys and men read Premchand as much as women do, and that and in this context there are Premchand of course would suggest all these things in his writings, but he would also talk about them directly to the reader, particularly the educated readers, in his essays. He was an editor. He edited, one or two magazines all his life, and there he would write. He would comment upon the situation of the time. And one important essay that I noted is called Mahajani Sabhyata. It is a famous essay written by him, and he is calling Mahajan. I think he didn't want to use a very a technical word like Udyogpati or something, industrialist, but he used the word Mahajan, and Mahajan could be a trader, Mahajan could be a dealer in money, etc. But Mahajani for him was capitalist. So he is talking about the capitalist culture, and that is what he is discussing in Mahajani Sabhyata. And there he says that at the level of sabhyata, at the level of culture, at the level of civilization, money has given us wrong ideas, wrong notions about life, as if money is everything, and that if you have money you got happiness and fulfillment. That is not the case. Money should be able to get us together with other human beings to enjoy things collectively. That is not happening. Money is turning us into individuals who compete with other individuals. So all of us are enemies of one another, and we fight with one another. You ask somebody studying in a school as to what his aim is, and he would always say, I would like to stand first in the class. And all parents tell their children to stand first. So the very idea of standing first becomes rather vague. Everybody can't stand first. So the purpose of education is not to make children look for the first position, but collectively engaging with the teacher and with themselves to earn knowledge, which will finally take them productively into the world where facilities are being produced. So in that kind of a world, people will participate in the processes of life. That is not how education or employment is being discussed. What is being discussed is that you should always compete with others and do better than them. And this is what is Mahajani Sabhyata so far as Premchand is concerned. So one should not be a part of the Mahajani Sabhyata of the capitalist culture, but as a part of society, as a human being who would help others grow together, so that finally we are able to make a culture which gives us happiness. And this is what he is saying very clearly, directly to the reader in his famous essay called Mahajani Sabhyata. And if you apply this to his novels and to his short stories, that Premchand is projecting this idea there also. In Godan, for instance, there are moments of happiness when Hori and Dhanya sit together and when they crack jokes at each other's cost, etc. Then that's a culture which is not based on money. They are poor people, but sometimes they enjoy themselves because they are laughing at things where all of them are equally affected, and well, somehow they can create a condition of happiness. That happiness that is there in Premchand's novels is because he is all the time criticizing that individualism which stands in the way of happiness, which comes together, which comes only when people get together and when they produce it collectively. So viewers, Premchand is talking about these things not merely in his novels and short stories, but also in his essays, where he is telling people directly that this Mahajani Sabhyata is to be attacked. Now, I refer to my own time. We refer to our own time in the 1980s, 90s, to 2010, 15, etc. At the moment. Do we take this idea of Mahajani Sabhyata seriously? I don't think so. So, in fact, we need a Premchand today, a Premchand to tell us that the world of competition has to be replaced by world of cooperation. So, don't compete with anyone else. And in fact, Premchand would say that Mahajani Sabhyata will remain till the society consists of unequals. So, if there is inequality in society, then those who are lesser, these people would like to catch up with the rest, and that way the competition becomes the watchword of today's life. So, in a way, Premchand finally becomes a critic of inequality in society, for the reason that people compete because they see somebody better in terms of money, and they want to equal them by working hard along those lines. Then the third point that I take up is with respect to the role of literature, the role of writers. This is also very important. Premchand is face to face with his readers most of the time in his novels, but sometimes by his own example, he tells writers to follow certain principles of writing, and those principles would be very, very important. Today's writers, if you ask a writer why he or she is writing, then the best answer that you will hear from a common writer would be that they want to express themselves. If they had to merely express themselves, then why share this expression? Why publish it? They can maintain a diary and they can just read it for their own pleasure, etc. In fact, people express, but that expression is to be shared with other people. And you can share expression with other people only when you say something, you make certain points which touch them also vitally.
Absolutely.
So that way, Premchand is telling the writer also today. And the writer, that's why writers are drawn more and more towards Premchand today, and that is why he is very popular among the writers today, because Premchand is telling writers to, to play a role in life. And Premchand himself wanted to play a role in life. In other discussions, this point was kept up always, that if you had to understand the situations in society, the state of politics, the state of India vis-a-vis the British power which ruled us, then you have to read, you had to read, in those days also, Premchand's novels. So people read in order to understand life, and that is the purpose of literature today also. So if you understand life today, and if you want to share that understanding with the reader, and if that understanding is that society is full of difficulties, then what should a writer do? What should a writer share with the audience? Should the writer say that, well, the life has to be harmonious, this and that we should all be breathing easy and nice, or do we say that anger also is important? I am raising a question. Is anger important, or is only happiness of a kind, that visualizes everybody as equal, that is important? What do you say?
That is a very interesting question that you have raised, sir. Absolutely, all the emotions are important at their place. And of course, if we see something wrong, like Premchand talks about, if you see something wrong, then you have to point it out. So anger in that sense is also important, but of course excess of anger would not be entertained.
Okay, and the second question, Gandhiji said don't hate anybody. So should we hate, should we keep hatred as some kind of a motive in writing or no? What do you say?
I would not like to see hatred as a kind of motive, but trying to put across our ideas, like Premchand wanted to tell people that don't just express yourself, but put across an idea that would sort of awaken somebody, or would make somebody question their own thoughts, whether I am doing the right thing or not.
But one should not preach hatred.
Yes.
I see. So let me shock you by telling you, and viewers, I am shocking you also by telling you that Premchand has written an essay, and the title of the essay is Sahitya mein Ghrana ka Sthan. The presence and the place of hatred in literature. Unless you tell people to hate certain things, you can't really tell them to emulate certain others. So hating is very important. And then he gives example. He says there are many social evils. Now there is violence within the domestic space, and there are the killings and murders, and there are people who poison others. Now should this be hated, or should we say we should totally enjoy all this?
No.
So in a way, social evils have to be hated. They have first to be recognized as existing, as something that is there, and then you should always, as a writer, make people to hate certain wrong things. So it's a very important essay, and very few writers have the courage to write this kind of
Absolutely.
an essay. But Premchand wrote this essay calling Sahitya mein Ghrana ka Sthan. That you have to make the readers hate certain wrong things, bad things, and then he once again gives the example of capitalism. He says that if people are criticizing others, if they are discriminating on the basis of caste, gender, etc., then that tendency is to be hated. It should be condemned. So writers should be very, very clear on this. And for this reason, that when writers write like this today, then their books are sometimes proscribed. And Premchand started his career with a book which the Britisher did not like. So in I think 1908 or 9, his book was banned. So which means that the writer should always take that kind of a stand which helps people understand what is to be done and what is not to be done. And what is not to be done is as important as what is to be done is important. And he is telling the writers this, that if you don't like a particular thing in your life, then you must make it a point to express things in such a manner that people start hating it, people start attacking it. So if there is some kind of inequality is there, if there is double dealing, if there is corruption, what is called Bhrashtachar today, then I don't think Bhrashtachar should be tolerated. And you should understand, you should treat it with sympathy. You should always should treat it with some sense of criticism, and that is what, and he's taking a very clear stand on this, that unless you tell people this is wrong and this is to be hated, you can't really write something worth writing. So he is telling these writers to project the idea of humanist culture and to attack those principles of culture which take us away from human beings and which divide humanity along lines of caste and creed. So these are the questions that Premchand is raising today. He raised in his own lifetime, and writers, if they have to look for guidance today with respect to their writing, then of course Premchand would be relevant, and that's why people go back to him. I don't think many people knew in the 1960s and 70s about these essays and about some of the short stories that I mentioned, but now those stories and these essays have become once again relevant, and viewers, I would be very happy that if you searched for this essay and read it and then discussed it. Premchand would not mind if you criticized him, so you criticize him also, but read his essay, and this essay, Sahitya mein Ghृणा का स्थान, or the place for relevance of hatred in literature, then he is making a point, and that point is to be understood in its context. In fact, when in 1936 Premchand was asked to preside over the function that was organized by the progressive writers, this was the first meet of the first conference of the progressive writers, and he was the president, and he from there he told the writers to do certain things and not to do others. And there he said, you be the conscience of the time, conscious of the age, and you take courage in both the hands and write what you feel is right, or what you feel is true. So all these things he was in fact asking writers to take a position on the wrong things and assert without any problem of without fear or any kind of a problem. And I would straight away say that this address should be it is available now in English translation. You can read those who do not know Hindi, they can read Premchand's address in English translation. It's published, and there he is talking about the aims and objectives of writers. In fact, the title of the English translated text is Aim of Literature, and in Hindi it is called Sahitya ka Uddeshya, and there he is talking about Uddeshya. In fact, this Uddeshya would be very controversial in the 1950s and 60s, because most of the writers would say Sahitya should not, literature should not pursue any Uddeshya, any aim. But if Sahitya does not have any Uddeshya, any aim, etc., then Sahitya becomes merely expression, as I said, and they called it expression. But then in 1980s, 90s and 2000 onwards, people now want to write with a purpose. So that purpose is very important, and the writers have to. In fact, it's very difficult to find out what the purpose is. In order to establish a sense of purpose in writing, one has to look around critically. One should, for instance, read the newspaper carefully. One should enter into an argument and a discussion with others. One should keep one's ears and eyes open. One should also have a keen, perception of the economic reality, which is affecting all of us directly or indirectly. Then only, we will be able to see that sense of purpose which the writer, in fact, has to pursue in life. One of the last points that I'll discuss today with respect to Premchand is his, and this is a very contentious issue again, viewers, and I'm sure many of you might even disagree with me. Premchand is talking about the adoption of that language in which you can communicate things to a very large audience. Can that language be English? Is the question. Can you would you adopt English as a medium of communication so far as literature is concerned? Is the question that Premchand was posing.
Well, I think it can be very individuals. So I would definitely accept English as a language. For me, it is a language I can comfortably communicate in. But if I go back to the time when he was writing, I think more people would be well versed in Hindi. In fact, when you were mentioning, there were some people who could not even read, and then these texts were read out to them.
Yes, true.
Yes.
That's right. So I would say that Premchand solved this problem. You very rightly pointed it out in his own time, and his own time was when people didn't even have the capability to understand Hindi. They could not read Hindi properly. So Premchand was writing for an audience which would at least read Hindi, and Premchand himself did not know Hindi initially. Viewers,
very interesting.
He knew Urdu. He didn't know Hindi. And when he realized, that he can communicate his intent to the audience in Hindi, then he took to Hindi.
Right.
So after a few years, he started writing in Hindi, and till that time he was giving his Urdu text to some friend, somebody who would render this into some kind of Hindi. So his approach to language was just the functional approach. It should work to the advantage of the reader. So Premchand would write in a language through which he can reach the largest number of people, and if a large number can be approached through English, then we can take up English. But let me tell you, viewers, that we can approach English readers only in the cities, and if we write about the village, and if we write for the benefit of the villagers, etc., then we have to take recourse to another language. There the contentious issue is what kind of Hindi. Hindi also can be difficult, like English can be easy. English also can be difficult. The same is true about Hindi. Hindi can be Tatsam Hindi, it can be Sanskritized Hindi, it can be a Hindi which only very few understand. So would Premchand write in that kind of Hindi is the question. And you read Premchand's novels in Hindi, and in descriptions he is written generally in Persianized Urdu, which is difficult to understand, and somebody rendered it in Hindi, and that Hindi also is difficult. But Premchand in his true elements is when he makes his characters talk. Then he takes the dialogue very seriously, and he writes in a dialogue that people follow with great interest and curiosity, and therefore Premchand is a votary of neither Hindi, which is difficult, nor English, which nobody understands at that time, but a Hindi which is very close to Hindustani. So this word Hindustani is there in Premchand's time. So whether it has to be Urdu, whether it has to be Hindi, or it has to be Hindustani, and then he would say something between Hindi and Urdu, which he calls Hindustani. And in fact, political leaders agreed with him. Gandhiji was in total agreement with Premchand on this, and this debate occurred sometime in the 1920s and 30s. And Gandhiji said, that yes, Hindustani should be used. Now imagine I've talked about the criticism of Premchand in the 1950s and 60s. Now some debates occurred in the 1950s and 60s, and Hindi writers were asked to write in Hindustani, and all of them reacted very sharply to this, and they said they would write in a language that they want to write in, and they will not take dictates from anyone. And their language then became confined to the idiom of the city. And maybe that's the reason why most of us today do not even know who were the writers in the 1950s and 60s, or who are writing even today, because the writers do not bother about the nuances that can be expressed through the language of the street. They always write for the academic critic, they always write for the academic reader. They want their books to be seen as textbooks, as subject of study in the classroom. But a writer who has to express the concerns of his age should not bother about these things at all. He should bother only about communicating his intent to a larger audience. So Premchand, I'm sure, will be more popular even today in terms of appeal, because he is writing in the language of the masses, and he writes a language which is very close to the language of the streets. And this problem, Premchand was able to solve, because at that point of time he was able to select Hindustani as the medium of expression. I will now wind up the discussion by using one or two points in brief. Premchand talked about the narrative mode, and the narrative mode would be mode when he is communicating, when he is addressing the audience, and for this Premchand would not describe things, would not give long points of information about it. He would simply say, okay, the person was this and he believed in these things, and then he said. and then inverted commas begin, and then there is an interesting thing. So Premchand is able to engage the reader with interest in his writing, and because of which he became popular at that point of time. Today also the writers have to learn this from him, and those who learn from him the art of telling the story, of narrating the story, it is they who make bigger sense for the audience. And we have to learn these things from Premchand, that one should write about humanism, one should write about the reality of life, one should try to communicate ideas in a language that people understand, and that one's style should be narrative. It should not be just descriptive, that you describe and you express, but that you narrate and you tell people to get into your kind of view. So for that one should keep writing, and I believe that Premchand would be able to engage today's audience with greater interest, and for that his relevance will increase. So
Right.
with this I think I should
Right,
finish
absolutely.
this.
So thank you so much for this very extremely interesting lecture. Of course, we have talked about Premchand earlier, but this has been even more enriching to talk about how his relevance, as the topic even mentions, the growing relevance, and how we have seen from the 1936 period when he died to the 50s, 70s, 80s, and of course now, in fact, he has become even more pertinent to our times considering the issues he raised. So, of course, I wish we had more time. We could discuss Premchand, but
Yes.
we could try and have it in some other lecture. So, with this, we take your leave, friends, and thank you so much, sir, for being with us today. Thank you, friends. Have a wonderful day ahead.